Case 1. Barbara Scott. She was 67 years old. She had a herb garden. She had a smile that neighbors remembered warmly. And beneath the rosemary and the soil of that quiet backyard in Central Florida, she had hidden something that would bring the full weight of the criminal justice system down on her life and send shockwaves through every person who thought they knew her. There are neighborhoods in Central Florida that carry themselves with a particular kind of quiet. Not the quiet of emptiness, but the quiet of people who have chosen, consciously, to live at a slower pace. Polk County is that kind of place in many of its corners. Lake Alfred, a small community tucked between Lakeland and Winter Haven, is that kind of town. Its streets are lined with modest homes. Its residents tend to know each other. The rhythms of daily life there are familiar, predictable, ordinary in the best possible sense. It was in that ordinarily peaceful setting that something deeply wrong began to unfold in the early days of January 2012. And it began the way so many of these stories begin, with a woman who had an explanation for everything, and whose explanations kept changing every time someone asked. Barbara Scott was 67 years old in January of 2012. Her husband, Benny Scott, was 77. By the accounts of those who knew them, Benny was a kind and gentle man. He was social. He was friendly. He had a daughter from a previous relationship, a woman named Sonia Broadway, who loved him and stayed in contact with him as a matter of course. The ordinary, unremarkable contact of a daughter who simply wanted to know her father was well. And then, at some point in January of 2012, Benny Scott stopped being reachable. Barbara had explanations. She told Sonia that Benny had traveled to Oklahoma to visit friends. She told other family members he was ill with a throat condition that made it impossible for him to speak on the phone. She told friends in Oklahoma, who called asking to speak with him, that he was unwell and resting. Each story arrived smoothly, easily, with the practiced ease of a woman who had thought through what she wanted people to believe and had committed to it entirely. But the stories didn't line up. The details shifted. The explanations evolved in ways that raised questions rather than resolving them. Daughters know their fathers. Sonia Broadway knew that something was wrong in a way that no explanation, however polished, however delivered with the authority of a woman who had decades of experience presenting herself as reliable, could fully address. Though he was in a shallow grave, he had been wrapped in a tarp. His hands had been bound. His feet had been bound. At the back of his head was a wound consistent with a close-range gunshot. It looked like a professional hit, the investigating detective noted in materials that later became public. This does not look like a suicide. The medical examiner's findings were unambiguous. Benny Scott had lost his life as a result of a gunshot wound to the head. The manner of his passing was ruled a homicide, and the data retrieved from his pacemaker, a device that records the electrical activity of the heart with meticulous, time-stamped precision, placed the moment of his passing at approximately 3 in the morning on January 2, 2012. That timestamp mattered because Barbara's own account of events did not match what the pacemaker recorded. The timeline she had constructed did not hold. Investigators searched the home. In a drawer, a specific drawer that Barbara herself directed them toward, they found a handgun. Forensic examination linked that weapon to the wound that had ended Benny's life. Blood traces were recovered from the bathroom and the garage, consistent with a sequence of events that the prosecution would later lay out in careful, methodical detail. And neighbors, when asked, mentioned something that added a particular texture to what was already a devastating picture. Barbara had been holding garage sales in the weeks and months after Benny's disappearance. She had been selling his belongings. His things were leaving the property quietly and without explanation, to strangers who had no idea what they were purchasing and from whom. Barbara Scott was formally charged with first-degree premeditated murder following a grand jury indictment in April of 2012. She was taken into custody and maintained her innocence from the first moment of her arrest to the last day of her trial. Her defense team worked to present an alternative narrative. They argued that Benny had taken his own life, that Barbara had panicked in the immediate aftermath of discovering him, that she had been paralyzed by grief and had made the terrible decision to bury him out of a desperate and misguided desire to protect herself and to avoid a reality she could not cope with. They argued that the act of concealment, however wrong, did not prove the act of taking a life. They pointed to her age, to her years of caregiving, to the emotional complexity of what she had faced. But the prosecution's portrait was built on evidence that the defense could not dismantle. They presented the forensic findings, the pacemaker data that contradicted Barbara's timeline, the weapon found in the drawer, the blood evidence, the manner in which Benny had been bound and wrapped and buried, the systematic way in which his belongings had been dispersed. They presented the evidence of Barbara's past as context. She had been convicted of embezzlement in 1988, having taken $64,000 from an employer, and had served time for that offense. She was not, the prosecution argued, a woman unfamiliar with the mechanics of hiding what she had done. Investigators also noted, during the course of their work, that Barbara had been married previously to a man named Marvin Toulette, who had passed away at the age of 53. His cause of passing had been recorded at the time as acute alcohol intoxication. In the context of what had happened to Benny Scott, that earlier loss acquired a different quality, though no charges were ever brought in connection with it. The jury received the case and deliberated for 1 hour and 30 minutes. On April 24, 2014, Barbara Scott was found guilty on both counts: first-degree premeditated murder and tampering with evidence. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, with a concurrent 5-year term attached to the evidence-related conviction. She was led out of the courtroom by deputies, past the people who had known Benny Scott, past the daughter who had never stopped asking where her father was, past the community that had watched this unfold over 2 years of investigation and prosecution, and finally, at the very end of it, truth. Benny Scott spent the last months of his life in a house with a woman who had decided, for reasons the court was never fully able to establish with certainty, that he would not survive it. He deserved better. He deserved the dignity of an honest accounting. He deserved for his daughter's questions to be answered honestly, the first time she asked. Florida's justice system made sure that the answers came, even if they were 2 years late. For anyone who has concerns about the welfare of an elderly loved one in a caregiving situation, the Elder Care Locator, a service of the United States Administration on Aging, is available at 1-800-677-1116. You do not have to wait to be certain before you make a call. If this case stayed with you, if the quiet horror of what was growing beneath that herb garden in Lake Alfred moved you in a way you did not expect, please take a moment to like this video. It costs you nothing, and it tells us that this work matters. And if you want to be here for every investigation we release, please subscribe to Cold Case Exploit and turn on your notifications. We are not done. We are just getting started. Case 2, Donna Adelson. On the morning of July 18, 2014, a law professor named Daniel Markell dropped his 2 young sons at preschool, went to the gym, drove home to his house on Trescott Drive in Tallahassee, pulled into his driveway, and was shot multiple times before he could reach his front door. He was rushed to a hospital. He did not survive. He passed on July 19, 2014, at the age of 39. He was a scholar of criminal law. He had dedicated his professional life to understanding how societies construct systems of accountability, how justice is supposed to work, how the mechanisms of law are built to restrain the impulses that lead people toward harming one another. He had 2 children. He had colleagues who loved and respected him. He had a future full of serious, consequential work ahead of him. He also had an ex-wife, and an ex-wife's family. And it is in the territory of that relationship, in the wreckage of a contested divorce and a bitter custody arrangement and a family matriarch who had decided that the outcome was unacceptable, that the story of what happened on Trescott Drive on July 18, 2014, truly begins. Daniel Markell and Wendy Adelson had connected through a Jewish dating service and married in 2006. By the time their marriage dissolved, they were deep in a custody dispute over their 2 small boys. The Adelson family, wealthy, prominent in South Florida, centered on the family dental practice known as the Adelson Institute, had strong views about the situation. Strong views about Daniel. Strong views about the fact that he had relocated to Tallahassee and was, in their perception, keeping the grandchildren at a distance from the family. At the center of those strong views, at the center of the family itself, stood Donna Adelson. She was the matriarch, the mother, the grandmother, the woman who, by every account that emerged during 11 years of investigation and prosecution, was deeply involved in every aspect of the lives of her adult children, controlling, by the prosecution's description, in a way that extended well beyond normal parental concern. Investigators and prosecutors painted a picture of a woman who had strong opinions about all decisions in Wendy's life, her career, her relationships, her housing, and, ultimately, the custody arrangement that kept her grandchildren in Tallahassee with a man the family had come to regard as an obstacle. Investigators worked the case from the beginning with the understanding that the professional-looking nature of the attack, the car that fled, the efficiency of what had happened, the absence of any apparent personal motive in Daniel's own life, pointed toward a contract situation. The threads they pulled eventually led south. Sigfredo Garcia and Luis Rivera were identified as the men who carried out the attack on Daniel Markel. Garcia was convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder in 2019 and sentenced to life in prison. Rivera entered into a plea arrangement, providing testimony that pointed toward the person he said had hired them, a woman named Catherine Magbanua. Magbanua was the mother of Garcia's child and the former romantic partner of Charlie Adelson, Donna's son. She was tried twice, the first trial resulting in a hung jury, and ultimately convicted on all counts in 2022, sentenced to life in prison with an additional 60 years for the conspiracy and solicitation charges. Charlie Adelson was arrested in 2022 and convicted in 2023 of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and solicitation to commit murder. He too was sentenced to life in prison with an additional 60 years. And then investigators turned their full attention to Donna. The evidence that prosecutors had been assembling over years pointed, they argued, to Donna Adelson as the person at the top of the plan. The person whose desire to resolve the custody situation, whose need to have things the way she wanted them, had set everything in motion. The communications that tied the participants together, the recordings that captured relevant conversations, the testimony of those who had already been convicted, all of it, prosecutors argued, led back to her. After Charlie Adelson's conviction in 2023, law enforcement made a discovery that accelerated the timeline. They determined that Donna Adelson had purchased a one-way ticket to Vietnam. Not a round trip. A one-way ticket to a country that has no extradition agreement with the United States. A country from which she could not have been legally compelled to return. She was at Miami International Airport, preparing to board the flight, when law enforcement intercepted her. She was 70 years old. She was taken into custody. She was charged with first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and solicitation to commit murder in the killing of Daniel Markel. The decision to purchase that ticket, to attempt to leave the country with no stated plans to return, became one of the more quietly devastating elements of the case against her. It suggested an awareness of what was coming. It suggested a calculation about the odds. It suggested that Donna Adelson, after 11 years of watching the people around her be arrested, tried, and convicted, understood that the investigation was about to reach her. The trial of Donna Adelson began in the summer of 2025 and ran for several weeks in Tallahassee. Prosecutors laid out the evidence methodically and in extraordinary detail. The history of the family's hostility toward Daniel Markel, the pattern of communications that tied the participants together, the recordings that captured relevant exchanges, and the testimony of those who had already been convicted and were now speaking to the court about what they knew and who they believed had wanted this outcome. Defense attorneys pushed back at every stage. They argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that it did not definitively place Donna at the center of the plan, that the real architects of the crime were others, and that their aging client, a grandmother in her 70s, had been wrongly elevated in the narrative of the prosecution's case. They noted that her daughter, Wendy, had not been charged and urged the jury to consider carefully who was and was not being held responsible. The jury heard all of it. They deliberated. And on September 5, 2025, they returned a verdict of guilty on all 3 counts: first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and solicitation to commit murder. On October 14, 2025, Donna Adelson appeared before Circuit Judge Stephen Everett for sentencing. She spoke. She maintained her innocence. She said what had happened to Daniel Markel was unforgivable, but insisted she had nothing to do with it. She said she had never received a parking ticket. She said she was going to prison for a crime she did not commit. Judge Everett interrupted her multiple times. He told her the statements she was making demonstrated what he described as an utter lack of remorse. He told her the court found the evidence in the case to be clear. He sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the murder charge. He added 30 consecutive years for the conspiracy and solicitation counts. Donna Adelson, 75 years old, was led from that courtroom in a purple jail jumpsuit, shackled, into a sentence from which she will not emerge. 11 years. 5 trials. Multiple convictions. And at the end of it, the full architecture of what had happened to Daniel Markel on the morning of July 18, 2014, why it happened, who wanted it to happen, and who was responsible for setting it in motion, was on the public record. Daniel Markel's mother, Ruth Markel, had attended proceedings, had waited, had held on to the hope that her son's case would be fully resolved. She said she was proudest of Daniel not for his scholarship or his reputation or his career, but for the father he had been to his 2 boys. Those boys grew up without him. They grew up in the shadow of a loss that was not accidental, not a tragedy of nature or circumstance, but a deliberate choice made by people who decided that their preferences outweighed his right to live. The courts of Florida, over 11 years, said otherwise. For victims of violent crime and their families seeking guidance and advocacy support, the National Center for Victims of Crime is available at victimsofcrime.org and by telephone at 1-800-394-2255. If the scale of this case, the years it took, the patience of investigators, the relentlessness of accountability, moved you in any way, please like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Exploit. 11 years is a long time to wait for justice. But it came, and we were here to tell the story. Case 3, Lois Riess. She looked like anyone's grandmother. That was the phrase that appeared in law enforcement statements, in news reports, in the documentary coverage that followed her arrest and her conviction. It was a phrase that investigators used with a kind of careful deliberateness, because the point was not to diminish her or to treat her appearance as a curiosity, but to make something specific and important clear. The danger she represented was invisible in the way that the most carefully constructed dangers always are. She looked like someone's grandmother, and that was exactly what made her so dangerous. Lois Riess was born in 1962 in Rochester, Minnesota. She grew up in the Midwest, married her husband David when she was 20 years old, and by outward appearances built a life of quiet normalcy. David ran a waxworm farm. Lois had operated a daycare from their home. They had 3 children together. They had been married for decades. They attended local events. They ate at the Servicemen's Club. Their neighbors and acquaintances described them as familiar, ordinary, unremarkable in the way of people who have simply built a life and are living it. But beneath the surface, something had been fracturing for years in ways that no one around Lois fully understood. She had developed what investigators later confirmed was a serious gambling addiction, one that had driven her, quietly and repeatedly, into financial arrangements that were not legal. She had been investigated in 2015 for felony theft after stealing money from her own disabled sister. The investigation did not result in prosecution. The behavior, however, continued. And by the time 2018 arrived, the gap between the life Lois presented to the world and the financial reality beneath it had grown into something that could no longer be managed. On March 22, 2018, David Riess was found at their home in Blooming Prairie, Minnesota, by sheriff's officers who had responded to a welfare check. He had been there for several days. He had sustained gunshot wounds. He did not survive. Lois was gone. A significant amount of money had been withdrawn from his accounts in the days before his passing. The family vehicle was gone. Law enforcement immediately identified Lois as the primary person of interest and began what would become a multi-state manhunt. What happened next was documented by surveillance cameras across the American South in a series of images that told the story of a woman who was moving with a kind of deliberate, unhurried calculation, stopping at casinos along the route south, captured on footage in Louisiana collecting a jackpot, and identifying herself with her own credentials, apparently unable to fully override the habits of a decades-long addiction even while in flight from a homicide investigation. She drove south. She crossed state lines. And she arrived, eventually, on the Gulf Coast of Florida, in the community of Fort Myers Beach, a coastal resort area that draws visitors and seasonal residents from across the country. It was there that she encountered Pamela Hutchinson. Pamela was 59 years old. She had traveled to Fort Myers Beach from her home in Virginia Beach to help a friend scatter the ashes of the friend's late husband. She was warm, approachable, the kind of person who makes friends easily in the casual social atmosphere of a beach community. And she bore a notable physical resemblance to Lois Riess. Similar build, similar coloring, similar general appearance. Investigators would later express their belief that this resemblance was not coincidental, that Lois had identified Pamela as a potential source of a replacement identity and had cultivated the friendship between them with that specific purpose in mind. Surveillance footage from the Smoke and Oyster Brewery in Fort Myers Beach showed the two women together, eating, talking, presenting to the cameras, and to anyone who might have glanced at them the entirely ordinary image of two middle-aged women enjoying a meal at a beachside restaurant. There was nothing visible in those frames to suggest what was being planned. On April 9, 2018, Pamela Hutchinson was shot and lost her life inside her rental condo at a complex in Fort Myers Beach. Investigators believe the air conditioning in the unit had been deliberately lowered before Lois left, a measure intended to slow the rate of detection. Pamela's body was not discovered until days later, when maintenance staff responding to a reported water issue began checking units and found her. By the time her body was found, Lois Riess had been gone for days. She had taken Pamela's identification documents, her credit cards, her white Acura TL. She had withdrawn more than $6,000 from Pamela's bank accounts using Pamela's credentials. Surveillance footage captured her using those cards, checking into hotels under Pamela's name, moving through the country as someone else. The real Pamela Hutchinson left behind, undiscovered, in a Fort Myers Beach condo with the temperature turned down. Law enforcement across the country mobilized rapidly. The case became national news. Dateline NBC profiled the search. ABC's 2020 covered it. Investigators in Florida and Minnesota coordinated. The phrase "killer grandma" attached itself to Lois Riess in coverage that reached every corner of the country, a phrase that carried within it the same disturbing contradiction that had made her so effective for so long. She looked like anyone's grandmother. She looked like someone you would trust. She was caught on April 19, 2018, at a restaurant on South Padre Island, Texas. United States Marshals apprehended her without incident. In a motel room nearby, investigators found two firearms, a 9mm and a .22 caliber, latex gloves, duct tape, and Pamela Hutchinson's hat and driver's license. The presence of those items led investigators to express the belief that Lois had been in the process of identifying another target when the arrest was made. A woman in Texas who had briefly befriended Lois in the days before her arrest told journalists that she had had no idea she was speaking to someone wanted for 2 homicides. "We hit it off like we were going to be best friends," the woman said. In December of 2019, Lois Riess appeared in a Florida court and pleaded guilty to 4 charges arising from Pamela Hutchinson's passing: first-degree murder, grand theft, identity theft, and related offenses. In exchange for her plea, prosecutors withdrew the pursuit of the death penalty. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. State Attorney Amira Fox stated it directly and without ambiguity: "This defendant will never get out of prison. This life sentence also alleviates any appellate issues that could arise and guarantees she will never be free again." Lois was subsequently extradited to Minnesota. In August of 2020, in a proceeding conducted inside a school auditorium because of the public health protocols then in place, she pleaded guilty to the murder of David Riess. She addressed the court. She spoke about her late husband with what appeared to be genuine emotion, saying that her life without him was her sentence, that her heart would always be his, that she should never have taken him from his children and grandchildren. Dodge County District Court processed her plea. The sentence was life in prison. She is currently serving concurrent life sentences at a correctional facility in Minnesota. She has been the subject of an HBO documentary. She is not eligible for parole. She will not be released. Pamela Hutchinson had traveled to Fort Myers Beach to help a grieving friend say goodbye to a loved one. She had done something quietly generous and decent and entirely ordinary. She had extended friendship to a stranger at a beach bar. And because she happened to look like a woman who was running from a homicide investigation and who had decided that stealing another person's identity was preferable to facing accountability, she did not go home. Pamela Hutchinson deserved to go home. For anyone who has lost a loved one to an act of violence and is seeking support, the Homicide Survivors Organization provides peer support and advocacy resources at homicidesurvivors.org. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Exploit. The story of Lois Riess is one of the most extraordinary fugitive cases in modern American criminal history, and it ends, as these stories must end, with accountability. Case 4. Susan Lorincz. Sometimes the most disturbing cases are not the ones that unfold over years of concealment. Sometimes they are the cases that happen in full view, in broad community awareness, documented across dozens of law enforcement calls and neighbor testimonies and recorded disputes, and still end in a way that should never have been possible. The community of Quail Run, near Ocala in Marion County, Florida, is a residential apartment complex of the kind that exists in every mid-sized American city. It has shared outdoor space. It has children who play in that outdoor space. It has neighbors who know each other to varying degrees, some better, some barely at all, and who share the ordinary frictions and courtesies of people living in proximity to one another. By 2021, one of those frictions had begun to take on a quality that went well beyond the ordinary. Susan Lorincz was 60 years old and had lived in the complex for approximately 3 years by the time the events that would define her case fully escalated. The grassy area near her apartment was also near the apartment of Ajike Owens, who was a 35-year-old mother of 4 children. Those children played outdoors. They were children. They played in the way that children play, with noise and movement, and the complete unawareness of inconvenience that belongs naturally to anyone under the age of 12. From the accounts of multiple neighbors, documented in law enforcement records and later in trial testimony, Lorincz had strong and consistently expressed views about the children's presence in that shared space. She had called law enforcement repeatedly. Multiple call responses to the property had been logged since at least January of 2021. Witnesses described her as consistently hostile about the children's activity near her home, and more than one witness documented language that was, by their account, racially charged, descriptions of the children using terms that investigators documented in their reports, language that placed the dispute in a context that went beyond a simple noise complaint. By the time June 2, 2023 arrived, there had been nearly 2.5 years of documented friction. On that evening, Lorincz got into a physical altercation with Owens' children in the shared outdoor area. She threw a roller skate at Owens' 10-year-old son, striking him in the foot. She also reportedly swung an umbrella at another child nearby. The children went back to their apartment and told their mother what had happened. Ajike AJ. Owens walked to Susan Lorincz's door. She walked there without a weapon. She walked there in the presence of her 10-year-old son, who stood beside her. She knocked on the door. She called out. She asked Lorincz to come outside. Lorincz was inside. The door was locked. She had already called 911 twice that evening, once reporting trespassing, the second call coming moments after what happened next. She was aware that law enforcement were on their way. She went to another room, retrieved a .380 caliber handgun, returned to the front of her apartment, and discharged a single round through the closed and locked front door. The bullet struck Ajike Owens in the upper chest while she stood on the other side of that door. Her 10-year-old son was standing beside her. Neighbors across the street heard the shot and then heard a child's voice, a child calling out that his mother had been hurt, that she had been shot. First responders arrived quickly and administered emergency care, but Ajike Owens did not survive. She was transported to a hospital and pronounced gone shortly after arrival. She was 35 years old. Her 4 children were between 3 and 12 years of age. The aftermath of the shooting generated an immediate and sustained public response. Lorincz was not arrested on the night of the incident, a decision by law enforcement that drew protests in the community and statements from civil rights attorney Benjamin Crump, who came to represent the Owens family and who called the shooting an unconscionable killing of a mother who simply knocked on a door. Marion County Sheriff Billy Woods stated that his department was evaluating the application of Florida's Stand Your Ground law before making an arrest decision, a statute that permits the use of deadly force when an individual reasonably believes it is necessary to prevent death or serious bodily harm. The question of whether that statute applied in any legitimate way to a woman who fired through a locked door, with law enforcement already en route, at an unarmed woman who was standing on the other side, became the central issue of the public conversation that followed. Lorincz was eventually arrested and charged with manslaughter with a firearm and assault. Her trial began in August of 2024. Her defense team argued self-defense throughout, presenting clinical testimony suggesting that Lorincz's own history of trauma and her diagnosed PTSD had affected her perception of threat in the moment, that when Ajike Owens pounded on her door and called out for her to come outside, Lorincz had genuinely believed she was in mortal danger. Her attorneys also challenged the prosecution's characterization of Lorincz's history with the neighborhood children, disputing the accounts of racial language and attempting to frame the long-running dispute as a two-sided conflict rather than a pattern of targeted hostility. Multiple neighbors testified about what they had seen and heard in the years leading up to June 2nd. They described Lorincz's hostility toward the children. They described language they had personally witnessed. They said they had not heard the specific threats that Lorincz claimed Owens had made on the night of the shooting. An all-white, six-person jury deliberated for 2 hours and 30 minutes before returning a verdict of guilty, manslaughter with a firearm, on August 16, 2024. On November 25, 2024, Marion County Circuit Judge Robert Hodges delivered the sentence. He spoke about the case with a directness that left little room for ambiguity. He said the shooting was completely unnecessary. He noted that Lorincz was behind a locked door. He noted that law enforcement were already on their way to the scene. He noted that she had moved from another room, retrieved a firearm, returned to the front of her apartment, and made a choice. He said he found that the shooting was based more in anger than in fear. He sentenced Susan Lorincz to 25 years in prison. Her release date, if she survives to see it, is April 8, 2048. She will be in her mid-80s. Pamela Diaz, the mother of Ajike Owens, stood in that courtroom and spoke. She spoke about her grandchildren, about 4 children who were between 3 and 12 when their mother was taken from them, who witnessed elements of what happened that evening, who have carried the memory of that night into every day that has followed. She spoke about the loss that does not end with the sentencing. She spoke about pain that lives in children's eyes even when they seem to be happy. Our pain and suffering didn't end when Susan was found guilty of manslaughter, she said. Our pain and suffering won't end with today's sentencing. Our pain and suffering will last a lifetime. Ajike Owens' 4 children live with their grandmother in a home away from where the tragedy occurred. The 2025 Netflix documentary The Perfect Neighbor examined the case in detail, bringing the story of A.J. Owens to a global audience. Ajike Owens knocked on a neighbor's door to address a situation in which her child had been physically struck. She was unarmed. She was a mother. She did not come home. And the accountability that followed, however imperfect, however insufficient to replace what was lost, was delivered by a jury and affirmed by a judge who looked at the evidence and said clearly, this was unnecessary. This should not have happened. For organizations supporting children who have lost a parent to violence, the National Children's Alliance at nationalchildren'salliance.org provides resources and advocacy for families in need. Please like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Exploit. A.J. Owens deserved to walk away from that door and go home to her children. We tell her story because she deserves to be remembered. Case 5, Virginia McGinnis. There is a particular kind of predator that the true crime genre has documented across decades, but that society still finds difficult to fully absorb. The predator who moves through the world slowly, who does not act in moments of visible rage or obvious malice, but who plans with patience and collects on those plans with a quietness that can go unnoticed for years, sometimes for decades, before the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Virginia McGinnis was that kind of predator. She was born in 1937 in Ithaca, New York, to a dairy farmer and his wife, in circumstances marked by poverty and what researchers who later studied her case described as early exposure to deprivation and abuse. She moved through her childhood and into adulthood with a determination that expressed itself in a particular direction, toward financial security, toward the accumulation of resources, and toward the people and the instruments, primarily insurance policies, that could provide that security with a degree of reliability that honest work had not. Virginia married. She had children. She moved frequently. And wherever she went, a pattern of loss followed her. Losses that were always terrible tragedies, always documented with appropriate grief, and always, somehow, accompanied by an insurance payment. Her 3-year-old daughter, Cynthia Elaine Coates, was found hanged in 1972. The passing was ruled accidental. Virginia collected on a life insurance policy. Investigators who later examined the case believed the ruling was incorrect, but at the time, no charges were brought. In 1974, a former husband named Sylvester Reardon passed away under circumstances that those same later investigators found deeply troubling. Over the years that followed, Virginia lived in at least 6 different homes across multiple states. All 6 burned to the ground at various points. Each fire resulted in an insurance claim. A writer covering her case would later observe that Virginia McGinnis had not merely committed crimes. She had built a system around them, had made the exploitation of insurance policies into something approaching a vocation. Virginia had connections to Florida across the years of her adult life. The state appears in the geography of her movements, and her son, who was himself later convicted in a separate criminal matter, was part of a family environment that investigators characterized as one in which predatory behavior had become normalized across generations. By the time she arrived at what became the most documented and definitively prosecuted crime of her career, Virginia was 50 years old and living in the San Diego area, married to a man named Billy Joe McGinnis, known to those around them as BJ. The couple had taken in a young woman named Deanna Wild. Deanna was 20 years old. She had grown up in Kentucky, had moved through a difficult family situation, and had found in the McGinnises what appeared to be stability, a middle-aged couple who offered her a place in their household, connection, and the warmth of what felt like a surrogate family. She was the kind of young person who extends trust because trust has not yet been catastrophically betrayed. Her mother, Bobby, tried to stay in contact with her from Kentucky. Virginia interfered with those communications, according to witnesses, in ways that steadily reduced Deanna's connection to the people outside the McGinnis household who might have recognized that something was wrong. On April 1, 1987, one day before the crime, Virginia brought Deanna to an insurance agency. A life insurance policy for $35,000 was taken out on Deanna Wild, with Virginia McGinnis listed as the beneficiary. The explanation offered was that Deanna was planning to travel to Mexico and that it was sensible to have coverage in place. The following day, April 2nd, Virginia and BJ took Deanna on a sightseeing trip to the Big Sur coastline in Northern California, one of the most dramatically beautiful and physically treacherous stretches of shoreline in the United States, where cliffs of several hundred feet drop directly to the rocks and the Pacific below. It is a place where the views are extraordinary and the margin for error is zero. Deanna was photographed on those cliffs. Virginia had a camera. She was taking pictures throughout the excursion. And those photographs, which investigators later obtained and examined with the assistance of forensic experts, told a story that Virginia could not explain away. In one photograph taken on the cliff edge, Deanna appeared not quite present. Her posture, her expression, the quality of her focus suggesting to investigators who studied the image that she had been given something to compromise her ability to function at full capacity. A blood sample that a coroner had preserved at the time of Deanna's passing was later tested and confirmed the presence of amitriptyline, a prescription antidepressant belonging to BJ McGinnis, at levels that would have significantly impaired Deanna's awareness and physical coordination. Deanna Wild fell from the cliffs at Big Sur. The distance of the fall was between 390 and 500 feet. She did not survive. Her injuries, when her body was recovered, were catastrophic and entirely consistent with a fall from that height. Virginia and BJ were on hand at a nearby convenience store moments after the fall, having reported to staff that their companion had slipped and gone over the edge. Their account was calm, their behavior appropriately distressed, their story internally consistent enough that at first, in the way of these cases, in the way that a well-constructed narrative always temporarily holds, no one immediately challenged it. Virginia filed the insurance claim almost immediately. It was in Kentucky that the first thread pulled loose. Deanna's mother, Bobby, found herself unable to collect on a small burial policy provided by Deanna's employer. The insurance company was asking questions. She sought legal assistance from a Louisville attorney named Stephen Keeney, and Keeney, in the course of trying to help her resolve the burial claim, began pulling on threads that led somewhere far darker than anyone had anticipated. His investigation into what had happened to Deanna Wild, his persistence across years of legal maneuvering and resistance and obstruction, became the subject of David Heilbronner's meticulously documented book Death Benefit, one of the most thorough accounts of insurance-motivated predation ever published. As investigators dug into Virginia's background, the scale of what they found was staggering. The pattern stretched back across decades and multiple states. The fires, the deaths, the claims, the daughter, the husbands, the accumulation of payouts from losses that kept occurring in circumstances that, examined individually, could be explained, but that examined together formed a portrait of deliberate, sustained, methodical predation. B.J. McGinnis was charged alongside Virginia with first-degree murder. He passed away from complications of illness on December 3, 1991, one day before jury selection was scheduled to begin in his trial. He died without ever facing a jury. Virginia McGinnis stood trial alone, beginning in January of 1992. The jury deliberated for 3 days and returned a verdict of guilty, first-degree murder for financial gain, in the passing of Deanna Wild. Virginia was also convicted of forgery and insurance fraud. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She died while incarcerated on June 25, 2011, at the age of 74. Her case was featured on Forensic Files and on Deadly Women. The Forensic Files episode, which referred to Deanna Wild by the pseudonym Donna Hartman, introduced the case to a new generation of viewers who found in it the particular horror of realizing how long a predator can operate when their methods are quiet enough and their victims trusting enough. Deanna Wild was 20 years old. She had done nothing to deserve what happened to her at Big Sur. She had simply trusted the wrong people, and the people she trusted had taken out a policy on her life before they took her to the edge of a cliff. For those who have lost loved ones to crimes involving financial exploitation and manipulation, the National Center for Victims of Crime provides advocacy and support resources at victimsofcrime.org. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Exploit. The story of Virginia McGinnis is one of the most chilling examples of sustained predation in American criminal history. We tell it because Deanna Wild deserves to be more than a case file. Case 6, Judy Buenoano. If you were to design, in the abstract, the most dangerous possible kind of person, the kind who could operate for years without being suspected, who could take lives and collect insurance payments and attend funerals and receive condolences and simply continue, you would design someone who looked nothing like what we expect danger to look like. You would design someone who occupied a role that confers automatic trust. Someone whose profession was care. Someone who looked, in every external way, like the kind of person you were grateful to have in your life. You would design someone who looked like Judy Buenoano. She was born Judy as Welty on April 4, 1943, in Quanah, Texas. Her mother passed away when she was 4 years old. She and her younger brother were sent to their grandparents. When her father remarried and established a new household in Roswell, New Mexico, the children joined it. And Judy later described that household as one marked by severe treatment, deprivation, and conditions that shaped her in ways the psychological record of her case would go on to document at length. By 14, she had attacked family members and been processed through the adult criminal system of New Mexico for it. A period of incarceration in a place that had no juvenile facilities and that offered a 14-year-old girl nothing in the way of rehabilitation or care. She graduated from reform school. She trained as a nursing assistant. She had a son, Michael, out of wedlock in 1961. In 1962, she married Air Force officer James Goodyear, and the family settled into life in Orlando, Florida. She had children with James. He adopted Michael. By the exterior standard of the era and the community, they were an ordinary family living an ordinary life in Central Florida. James Goodyear served in Vietnam. He returned home in declining health, nausea, vomiting, progressive physical deterioration. He lost his life on September 16, 1971. The official explanation attributed his passing to complications connected to his service. No investigation was conducted at the time. His wife collected on his life insurance policy. The pattern that would define the next decade of Judy Buenoano's life had begun. She entered a relationship with a man named Bobby Joe Morris, and the two relocated to Colorado, where Bobby Joe became ill in a way that bore remarkable similarity to what had happened to James Goodyear. The same symptoms, the same progression, the same outcome. Bobby Joe Morris passed away in January of 1978. Judy collected. She returned to Florida, this time settling in the Pensacola area. She opened a beauty salon with the proceeds from Michael's death that would follow. Michael Goodyear, or Michael Buenoano, as his mother came to call him after she legally renamed herself, had joined the United States Army. But something had been wrong with Michael for years. His muscles had been failing him. His limbs had lost function in a way that military medical staff found difficult to explain. He had been medically discharged from the Army and returned to his mother's home in Florida, fitted with heavy metal braces on his arms and his legs that compensated for the progressive deterioration of his muscular function. Those braces were the direct physical consequence of what had been happening to his body, a consequence of chronic arsenic exposure that would not be identified as such until years later. On May 13, 1980, Judy took Michael and her younger son James out on a canoe on the East River near Milton, Florida. The canoe overturned. James and Judy were able to reach the shore. Michael, weighted by the heavy metal braces on both his arms and his legs, was not able to swim. He sank. He did not survive. Judy Buenoano collected $20,000 from Michael's military life insurance policy and used the money to open a beauty salon. She moved forward. She entered a relationship with a businessman named John Gentry in 1982. The couple became engaged. They took out life insurance policies on each other. John's policy, which Virginia had encouraged and arranged, was valued at $510,000. She began providing John with what she described as vitamin capsules, which she encouraged him to take regularly and which he accepted from her without suspicion. His health began a slow, unexplained decline. Then, in June of 1983, as John was driving near Pensacola, his car exploded. A bomb had been wired to the ignition. John was severely injured. He survived. The car bomb was the mistake that ended the pattern. Explosives are not subtle. They draw law enforcement attention in a way that poisoning, particularly chronic poisoning administered in small doses over time, does not. Investigators were immediately involved. A search of Judy Buenoano's home uncovered wire and adhesive tape that matched the components of the device used in John Gentry's vehicle. The vitamin capsules she had been giving him were seized and tested. They were found to contain arsenic and paraformaldehyde, a combination specifically designed to harm. That discovery prompted investigators to look backward across the string of losses that had accompanied Judy's life. The bodies of James Goodyear, Bobby Joe Morris, and Michael Buenoano were exhumed. Forensic testing confirmed elevated arsenic levels in all three. James Goodyear and Bobby Joe Morris had lost their lives to arsenic poisoning. Michael had been so profoundly weakened by chronic arsenic exposure that he could not save himself when the canoe overturned on the East River. Judy Buenoano was arrested in 1983. The legal proceedings that followed were multiple and extended across 2 years. In 1984, she was convicted of Michael's murder and the attempted harm of John Gentry. She received a life sentence for Michael's case and a 12-year term for the Gentry case. In 1985, she was convicted of James Goodyear's murder and sentenced to death. She was additionally convicted of multiple counts of grand theft by insurance fraud. Investigators believe that the total insurance money she collected across her crimes amounted to approximately $240,000, a figure that represented, in cold financial terms, the value she had placed on the lives of the people closest to her. Judy Buenoano spent years on death row in Florida's correctional system. She appealed her convictions multiple times. She maintained her innocence in every public forum available to her. The Florida Supreme Court reviewed and affirmed her conviction and death sentence in 1988. Subsequent state and federal appeals were exhausted across the following decade. On March 30, 1998, at the age of 54, Judy Buenoano was executed by electrocution at Florida State Prison. She was the first woman executed in Florida since 1848, a distinction that marked the end of a case that had wound across decades, multiple states, multiple jurisdictions, and multiple lives that had been quietly and systematically ended by a woman who presented to the world the face of an ordinary Floridian, a salon owner, a caregiver, a mother who had suffered extraordinary losses and deserved compassion. She was none of those things. James Goodyear came home from Vietnam and lost his life to the person who was supposed to be his partner. Michael Buenoano spent years in physical deterioration caused by his own mother before losing his life on a Florida river, weighted down by braces he was wearing as a direct result of what she had done to him. Bobby Joe Morris and John Gentry trusted her. James Goodyear trusted her. They all trusted her. Accountability, in Judy Buenoano's case, arrived in the form of an electric chair at Florida State Prison at the end of the longest night of her appeals. It arrived because a car bomb in Pensacola in 1983 was too visible to ignore. It arrived because a coroner's blood sample told the truth about what was in someone's system even after the person was gone. The truth, in these cases, finds a way. For anyone experiencing a concerning pattern in a household or caregiving relationship, the National Domestic Violence Hotline is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, at 1-800-799-7233. One call can change everything. Please like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Exploit. The Black Widow of Florida is one of the most documented cases of domestic predation in this state's history, and every life she took deserves to be remembered by name. Case 7. Deborah Newton. Some cases resolve the way cases are supposed to resolve, quickly, with evidence, with an arrest that follows a crime within a reasonable period, with a courtroom proceeding that delivers accountability while the wound is still fresh enough that justice feels like it means something immediate. And then there are cases like the case of Deborah Newton, cases where the time between the crime and the reckoning is measured not in months, but in decades, where the people affected by what happened grow old waiting, where the only reason the story reaches a conclusion at all is because someone, somewhere, made a phone call. Joseph Newton and Deborah Newton had a daughter. Her name was Michelle. She was born on October 5, 1979, in Louisville, Kentucky. She was 3 years old in the spring of 1983. In April of that year, Deborah told Joseph that she had found work in Georgia and wanted the family to relocate. Joseph agreed. On April 2, 1983, Deborah left for Georgia with Michelle, saying she was going ahead to make arrangements. Joseph followed weeks later. They were gone. He reported his daughter missing. Michelle Newton's case was entered into the databases of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, the organization that has documented and worked to resolve the cases of missing and exploited children across the United States for decades. An investigation was opened. But in 1983, the investigative tools available to law enforcement were far more limited than they are today, and Deborah Newton, apparently aware of what she was doing and what it would require, had covered her tracks with a thoroughness that defeated every effort to find her for 42 years. She moved. She changed her name. She remarried. She built an entirely new life, in a new state, under a new identity, with a husband who, by every available account, had no knowledge whatsoever of who she actually was. She raised Michelle, whom she had given a different name, a different history, a different understanding of her own origins, in a way that severed her daughter from her father as completely as if Michelle had never existed in his world at all. Joseph Newton never stopped. He waited. He kept the case alive in whatever way a father can keep a missing child case alive across 4 decades of bureaucratic cycles and investigative limitations and the grinding, exhausting work of not letting the world forget that his daughter was out there somewhere. The case was reopened in 2016 when a family member asked investigators to re-examine it, and Deborah was re-indicted on custodial interference charges at that time. But there were still no leads on her location, no thread that investigators could pull. In 2024, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children released an age-progressed image of Michelle Newton, now approximately 45 years old, generated using the forensic imaging techniques that allow specialists to predict with reasonable accuracy how a face changes across the decades. That image was circulated. It was seen. And sometime in 2025, someone recognized something in it. A Crime Stoppers tip came in. It described a woman living in the Villages, one of the most well-known retirement communities in the United States, located in Marion County, Florida, drawing tens of thousands of residents who have come to spend their later years in a planned community built around leisure, comfort, and the ordinary pleasures of retirement. The woman went by the name Sharon Neely. She was living with a husband. She walked a dog. She was part of a community that knew her as Sharon. A United States Marshals Task Force detective obtained a recent photograph of the woman and compared it to the 1983 image of Deborah Newton. A Jefferson County detective reviewed the comparison and confirmed the resemblance. DNA was collected from Deborah Newton's biological sister, who still lived in Louisville, Kentucky. The analysis returned a match of 99.9%. The woman living in the Villages, the woman who went by Sharon Neely, was Deborah Newton. On November 24, 2025, law enforcement arrived at her home in Marion County. Body camera footage captured the moment deputies approached her in her driveway as she was walking her dog in the early morning. She appeared confused. She spoke to her husband, who was present. She told him she did not know why they were there. She told the deputies she did not understand what was happening. Deputies confirmed who they were looking for and that they were there to make an arrest. Deborah Newton, 67 years old, was taken into custody without resistance. She was booked into the Marion County Jail. She was subsequently extradited to Kentucky, where she faced charges of custodial interference, a felony offense that, by the specific design of the statute, carries no statute of limitations. The lawmakers who constructed that law understood something that this case confirms. The harm of taking a child from a parent does not diminish with time. It compounds. It grows. It becomes the texture of every year that passes in which a father does not know where his daughter is, and a daughter does not know who she really is. Michelle Newton, by the time investigators located her, had been living for decades under the name her mother had given her. She was an adult. She had built a life. And then law enforcement contacted her and told her that the life she had been living under the name she had been given was not, in the most fundamental sense, her actual life. That her real name was Michelle Newton. That her real father was Joseph Newton, a man in Louisville, Kentucky, who had been searching for her for 42 years. Michelle Newton and her father were reunited. The Newton family attended the court proceedings together. People think calling in tips is snitching, the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office said in a public statement after the arrest. It isn't. You're helping victims. You're helping families. This case proves that one phone call can change a life. Legal proceedings against Deborah Newton are ongoing at the time of this documentary's production. The full scope of what she will face is still being determined by the courts. But the arithmetic of what she took is not complicated. Joseph Newton spent 42 years not knowing where his daughter was. Michelle Newton spent 42 years not knowing who she was. Those are not abstract losses. They are 42 years of birthdays, of milestones, of the ordinary, irreplaceable texture of a family's life together. The holidays and the phone calls and the graduations and the quiet, everyday moments that make up what it means to know and be known by the people who are supposed to love you from the beginning. All of it taken by one decision, by one person who drove away on April 2nd, 1983, and did not look back. But accountability looked forward. And eventually it found her. In a retirement community in Marion County, Florida, walking a dog, living under a name that wasn't hers, 42 years later. For families of missing children, and those who want to report information about missing persons cases, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children is available at 1-800-843-5678. That is 1-800-THE-LOST, 24 hours a day. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Exploit. 42 years. One phone call. That is what it took. Please make the call. Case 8, Christine Falling. There is a particular quality of horror that attaches to cases involving the youngest victims, not because any victim matters more than another, but because there is something in the absolute helplessness and innocence of a very small child that makes the violation of their safety register differently. When an infant or a toddler loses their life, we understand at a fundamental level that they had no capacity whatsoever to protect themselves, no awareness that they needed protection, no ability to call for help or signal distress or reach someone who might intervene. They were entirely dependent on the person in the room with them. And in the early years of the 1980s, across multiple towns in northern and central Florida, the person in the room with them was Christine Falling. Christine was born on March 12, 1963, in Perry, Florida, the county seat of Taylor County in the northern part of the state. Her birth circumstances were by any measure difficult. Her father was 65 years old at the time she was born. Her mother was 16. The family existed well below the poverty line. Christine did not receive the developmental support that a child needs in her earliest years. She struggled with epilepsy, a condition that required ongoing medical management. She struggled in school in ways that were visible and documented and that received no meaningful intervention. She left before completing the 7th grade. Family members and those who knew her from childhood recalled behaviors that, in retrospect, were alarming. A pattern of harming small animals, particularly cats, which she would drop from heights or otherwise subject to harm. describing the behavior later as testing whether they truly had 9 lives. It was the kind of behavior that, recognized and addressed, might have led to intervention. It was not recognized. It was not addressed. Christine Falling entered her teenage years without the support or the framework that might have redirected what was developing inside her. By 14, she had married a man in his 20s, a union that lasted briefly and ended. By her late teens, she had settled into the work of babysitting for families in her community, neighbors, relatives, people who knew her or thought they did, people who needed someone to watch their children, and found in Christine a young woman who appeared willing and available and who charged what she charged and showed up when she was supposed to. The first child to lose their life while in Christine Falling's care was Cassidy Johnson. Cassidy was 2 years old, known to her family by the nickname Muffin, living in Blountstown, Florida. On February 25, 1980, she was rushed to a medical facility after Christine reported that she had become unresponsive. She did not survive. She passed on February 28, 1980. An autopsy identified severe head injury as the cause of her passing, not the encephalitis that physicians had initially suspected. A physician involved in her care wrote a note to law enforcement expressing serious doubts about Christine's account of what had happened, that Cassidy had simply passed out and fallen from her crib. That note was lost. The case was closed. Christine Falling moved to Lakeland. In the early summer of 1980, 4-year-old Jeffrey Davis lost his life while in Christine's care. Physicians who examined the case listed myocarditis as the cause, a condition involving inflammation of the heart muscle that is rarely fatal in otherwise healthy children. The loss was treated as a medical tragedy. 3 days later, while Jeffrey's family attended his funeral and Christine had been engaged to care for Jeffrey's 2-year-old cousin Joseph Spring, Joseph also passed while in her care. Again, a cardiac explanation was offered. The losses accumulated in a way that should have, earlier, generated the level of investigative scrutiny that was eventually applied. In July of 1981, 8-month-old Jennifer Daniels passed while Christine was watching her. Christine told Jennifer's mother, who had briefly left to purchase groceries, that the baby had simply stopped breathing. An elderly man in the community, whose passing on his first day under Christine's care as a housekeeper had been attributed to natural causes, was also later identified as someone whose loss had in fact been connected to her. In July of 1982, 10-week-old Travis Dwayne Coleman passed while at Christine's mobile home in Blountstown. Sudden infant death syndrome was offered, again, as the explanation. By 1982, there were simply too many losses connected to one person for investigators to continue treating them as unrelated tragedies. The pattern was undeniable when viewed as a pattern. The same person, the same circumstances, the same outcome. Multiple children, across multiple cities, over the course of 2 years, in the care of one individual. Christine Falling was taken into custody. She was questioned. Her accounts of what had happened shifted and evolved in the way that accounts do when the person providing them is attempting to construct a narrative rather than recall a truth. And then she confessed. She confessed to harming the children in her care. She said she had heard voices. Case 9. Hilma Marie Witt. There are crimes committed in rage. There are crimes committed in desperation. There are crimes committed in the fractured, compressed moments when a person's capacity for judgment fails entirely and something irreversible happens before anyone, including the person responsible, has processed what is about to occur. And then there are crimes that are built, constructed across months or years, that require sustained pressure and the manipulation of others and a level of deliberateness that removes any possibility of attributing what happened to a momentary failure of reason or control. The crime that defines the case of Hilma Marie Witt was of the second kind. It was built, and it was built by a mother, using her own children as the instruments through which she intended to achieve the outcome she had decided on. Marie, as she was known throughout her life, she went by her middle name, was born in 1948 in Delray Beach, Florida. Her father ran a nudist camp in the South Florida Sun, an unconventional setting that placed her childhood outside the ordinary social frameworks of the era. It was at that Florida camp that her father met Paul Witt, a young man from Michigan City, Indiana, who had served in the United States Navy straight out of high school. Paul and Marie married in 1964. She was 16. He was 27. The age gap and the unusual circumstances of their meeting set the tone for a relationship that would, across the decades that followed, accumulate an enormous weight of resentment, fear, accusation, and eventually violence. The family eventually settled away from Florida. They had 2 sons, John and Eric, who grew up in the household that Paul and Marie built together, a household that was, by the testimony that later emerged in court, far more complicated and far more pressured than anyone outside it understood. Marie told her sons things about their father across the years of their childhood and adolescence. She told them he was a threat. She told them he was abusive. She framed their family situation in terms of danger, of precariousness, of the terrible things that would happen to all of them if Paul's plans, specifically, his apparent intention to pursue a divorce, were allowed to proceed. She told them they would lose their home. She told them they would lose their stability. She told them that the only way to protect the family was to remove the source of the danger. She told her teenage sons that their father needed to be taken out of the picture. What followed was the product not of a single conversation, but of a sustained campaign of influence that investigators and prosecutors later described as systematic manipulation of the most intimate and psychologically powerful variety available to her. The authority of a mother over children who had grown up inside the worldview she had constructed for them, who had been taught from within that framework how to understand what they were being asked to do and why it was necessary. John Witt acted first. Paul Witt lost his life as a result of his son's actions, in a crime that was in every meaningful sense the product of what Marie had told her children, what she had asked of them, and what she had shaped them to believe was justified. Eric was also involved. 2 young men committed an act of violence against their father because their mother had spent years constructing the conditions under which that act would seem, to them, like the logical and necessary conclusion of the situation they were in. When investigators began examining what had happened, they found the evidence of Marie's role not in a single dramatic confrontation, but in the accumulation of what she had said and done over time. In the testimony of her sons, who cooperated with prosecutors in exchange for plea arrangements of their own, and who described the sustained pressure their mother had applied. John Witt pleaded guilty to a reduced charge of voluntary manslaughter and received a sentence of 20 years. Eric Witt made a similar arrangement. Both agreed to testify against their mother, providing the court with a detailed account of the process by which Marie had moved them toward the act she had decided she wanted them to commit. Hilma Marie Witt was tried in 1985. She was convicted of murder and conspiracy to commit murder. She was sentenced to a combined 90 years in prison. Her case was later featured on Oxygen Snapped, examined as one of the more disturbing examples in the documented record of parental manipulation leading to family violence. Legal analysts who studied the case noted that what made it particularly significant was the clarity with which it illustrated how the psychological authority of a parent, when deliberately weaponized, can override the judgment of children who have been raised to trust that parent absolutely. Paul Witt married young, served his country, built a family in the specific South Florida setting where his father-in-law ran his unusual establishment, and spent decades in a marriage that ended in the most violent possible way, not because of a momentary confrontation, not because of an act of rage, but because of a decision made by the woman he had married. A decision that she then spent years putting into motion through the minds and hands of his own sons. Paul Witt deserved better. His sons deserved better. The children of parents who use their children as instruments of their own conflicts are victims in ways that the legal system has historically struggled to fully address. And Marie Witt's case is a stark illustration of why that struggle matters. For anyone navigating the complex and painful terrain of family conflict, coercive control, or situations in which a parent's influence has become harmful to children's well-being, the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233 provides confidential support and guidance at any hour. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Exploit. The story of Hilma Marie Witt is a reminder that accountability has to reach the people who plan, not just the people who carry out what was planned. Case 10, Joyce Cohen. Coconut Grove, Miami, in the 1980s was a place of a very specific kind of glamour, sun-drenched and social, the kind of environment where wealth moved through spaces casually and where the lives of the people who inhabited it seemed to unfold at a pitch of intensity that the ordinary world did not quite match. It was a place where a woman who had grown up without much could arrive as the wife of a successful developer and find herself in a Coral Rock mansion on South Bayshore Drive, with a private jet and a ranch in Colorado and a social circle that reached into celebrity spaces and high-profile events. It was, by its own internal logic, everything that a certain kind of ambition could want. Joyce Cohen wanted it. And by the account of the prosecution that sent her to prison for life, when it appeared that she might lose it, when the marriage to Stanley Cohen began to deteriorate in ways that seemed to point toward a divorce settlement that would leave her without the life she had built, she decided that losing it was not acceptable. Joyce had come a long way to get to South Bayshore Drive. Born in Carpentersville, Illinois, to a family of modest means, her mother was of Polish descent. Her father was described as having Native American heritage. She had moved through early adulthood making the choices that seemed likely to lead somewhere better. She found work as a secretary. She found Stanley Cohen, a building developer 16 years her senior who had employed her in that capacity before their relationship became personal and then marital. They wed in 1981. The life that followed was, as Joyce herself described it in later interviews, a fairy tale. The mansion, the jet, the ranch, the access and the social standing and the ordinary luxuries of a life built on serious money. But the fairy tale had fractures. By the mid-1980s, the marriage had grown cold in ways that were documented during the trial that followed. There had been affairs on both sides. The couple had not been physically intimate for approximately 2 years, according to testimony. Stanley, prosecutors argued, had made his intentions regarding a divorce clear, and had further made clear that in the event of a divorce, Joyce would not walk away with the kind of financial settlement that would allow her to maintain the life she had. She stood to collect, prosecutors argued, approximately $1.4 million from Stanley's estate if he lost his life, along with additional insurance and financial holdings that together represented a significantly better outcome than what a divorce court was likely to award. At 5:25 in the morning on March 7, 1986, Joyce Cohen placed a call to 911. She was sobbing. She said her husband had been hurt. Law enforcement arrived at the mansion on South Bayshore Drive within minutes and found Stanley Cohen face down in the couple's four-poster brass bed. He had been shot 4 times in the head. A blood-soaked towel covered the wounds at the back of his skull. He was unclothed. There were no signs of forced entry. Nothing of significant value appeared to have been taken from the home. The scene struck the detective who first described it publicly, in retrospect, as having the quality of something staged rather than something that had occurred organically in the way that Joyce described. Joyce told investigators she had been in the back of the house, had heard a sound, and had seen shadowy figures leaving through the front door. She was consistent in this account across her initial interviews with law enforcement. She was also consistent in her claim that she had had no involvement whatsoever in what had happened to Stanley. The investigation moved quickly. Prosecutors built their case around the testimony of a man named Frank Zuccarello, who told the court that he had been present in a meeting in which the contract on Stanley Cohen's life had been arranged, and that Joyce Cohen had been the person who arranged it. He described her as the person who had planned and funded the agreement by which 3 men were to enter the Cohen home and ensure that Stanley did not survive the night. The prosecution also presented physical evidence. A discarded tissue found in the home that contained both mucus and gunshot residue, linking Joyce, they argued, to the immediate aftermath of what had happened in that bedroom. Defense attorneys mounted a vigorous challenge to Zuccarello's credibility. They pointed to his criminal history, to the deals he had been given, to the incentive structure that made his testimony in Joyce Cohen's case beneficial to his own legal situation. They argued that the physical evidence was open to innocent interpretation, that a woman who had just discovered her husband's body would naturally be in proximity to the scene and could have come into contact with residue in an entirely non-incriminating way. They challenged the entire narrative of the prosecution's case. The jury of 8 men and 4 women deliberated for 10 hours across 3 days. On November 17, 1989, they returned a verdict of guilty, first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and possession of a firearm during a felony. Joyce Cohen was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. She showed no visible emotion as the verdict was read. In the years and decades that followed, the case against Joyce Cohen became one of the most contested in Miami's criminal history. Multiple individuals connected to the case came forward after the conviction with accounts suggesting that the prosecution's central witness had not told the full truth, that the men who had pleaded guilty to participating in Stanley's passing did not in fact know Joyce Cohen and had not been hired by her. Her longtime attorney, Alan Ross, maintained across decades of post-conviction work that his client had been wrongfully convicted, that the evidence did not support the verdict, that the jury had been unduly influenced by Joyce's lifestyle and her reputation rather than by the facts of the case as actually established. Investigators who had worked the case took a different view. One former detective stated his belief that the crime scene itself, the stage quality of what had been found in that bedroom, the details that seemed arranged rather than discovered, pointed toward a domestic situation rather than a professional arrangement. Joyce Cohen's appeals were exhausted. Her parole application in 2013, when she was approximately 64 years old, was denied by a board that voted to extend her release date to 2048. She has remained at Homestead Correctional Institution in Miami-Dade County, one of the most prominent figures in the long and complicated history of Miami's most significant criminal proceedings. If she survives to see 2048, Joyce Cohen will be in her late 80s. She has maintained her innocence for decades. She has told journalists and interviewers that she did not do what the jury said she did. The courts of Florida, at every stage, have declined to disturb the conviction. Stanley Cohen was 52 years old. He lost his life in his own bed, in a home that he owned, in the early hours of a March morning in 1986. He was found face down by law enforcement who arrived in response to his wife's 911 call. He deserved to grow old. He deserved whatever the next chapter of his life was going to be, whether that was a divorce, a new beginning, or simply the ordinary continuation of a life that had not yet run its course. Whatever the full truth of what happened on South Bayshore Drive in the early hours of March 7, 1986, that life was ended violently and without warning. And the family that depended on him, the people who loved him, have spent 4 decades living with that loss. For victims of violent crime and their families, the National Center for Victims of Crime provides resources and advocacy support at victimsofcrime.org and by telephone at 1-800-394-2255. No one should face the aftermath of violent loss alone. This has been Cold Case Exploit's deep documentary investigation into 10 cases involving Florida women who faced the full weight of the state's justice system. Each case here is a real story. Each victim is a real person whose life was disrupted or ended by choices that the law was eventually compelled to address. We present these cases not for shock, but for the record, so that the victims are not forgotten, so that the investigations are honored, and so that the accountability that followed, however long it took to arrive, is witnessed and documented. The families of these victims carry these losses every day. The investigators who worked these cases for years, and in some cases for decades, deserve recognition for their persistence. And the witnesses who made calls, who came forward, who provided tips that broke cases open after years of silence, are proof that ordinary people have extraordinary power to change outcomes when they choose to use it. If any case in this documentary moved you, if any story here reminded you of why accountability matters, of why the truth has a way of eventually rising regardless of how deeply it has been buried, please take a moment right now to like this video. That single action tells the platform that this content deserves to reach more people. And if you want to be here for every investigation we release, every case we open, every story we tell, every file we refuse to let go cold, please subscribe to Cold Case Exploit and hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode. We are here. We are watching. We are not done.